There are three basic requirements which must be satisfied before we can start a gas turbine engine. They are that the compressor turbine assembly must be rotated to get air into the combustion chambers, that fuel must be provided in the combustion chambers, that ignition must also be provided in the combustion chambers to start the air-fuel mixture burning. Supplementary to these basic prerequisites for engine starting are two other requirements which satisfy servicing essentials. The necessity to motor over the engine with no igniters operating. This is sometimes called a blowout or motoring over cycle. The necessity to motor over the engine usually only occurs when there's been a failure to start. A failure to start is sometimes called a wet start. The need for the igniters to be operated independent of the start cycle. There are several methods of obtaining engine rotation upon engine start. The most common methods of rotating the high-pressure compressor on modern civil aircraft are the electric starter motor, the air starter motor. Any engine starter system will have a duty cycle. The duty cycle is the maximum time that the starter motor is allowed to be energized. The duty cycle may have to be followed by a cooling down period before the starter motor can be re-energized. The electric starter motor was the original means of starting a gas turbine engine, and is still used in smaller executive jets and helicopters. However, it's fallen out of favour in larger and more modern engines because of its weight. This picture shows a Dart engine where the electric starter motor is fixed in front of the compressor casing. The electric starter motor can, however, be attached to the engine accessory gearbox. In the latter circumstance, the starter drives the compressor through the gearbox. Rapidly becoming more popular on smaller engines is the starter-generator combination, which, because of its dual purpose, has a greater usefulness to weight ratio. The air starter motor is possibly the most popular starting system on large gas turbine engines. It's light, simple to use and very economical, insofar as it utilizes low-pressure air as its power source. The air starter motor is attached to the accessory gearbox of the engine. The sources of air available for engine start, in order of preference, are the Aircraft Auxiliary Power Unit, or APU. Use of an APU does not cost the airline anything, so it definitely will be the favourite method of supplying air for engine starting. The Ground Start Unit. If a ground start unit is required, perhaps because of APU unserviceability, the airline will have to pay for its use. This is understandably not too popular with the airlines. A crossbleed start, where air from an already started engine is used. A crossbleed start doesn't cost the airline anything, but it does require that the engine that supplies the air has power applied to it. In the crowded environment of the ramp, applying power to an engine carries obvious risks, and some airport authorities are reluctant to give permission to the pilot to carry out this type of operation. Air from one of these sources is fed through an electrically controlled air start valve to the starter motor's air inlet, where it's used to turn the turbine rotor. The air is subsequently exhausted to atmosphere. The turbine rotor turns the reduction gear, which rotates the engine high-pressure compressor shaft through a ratchet clutch arrangement, which is designed to prevent the starter motor being driven by the engine after engine start. The danger, should this happen, is that the starter motor will rotate at a speed sufficient to cause it to break up due to centrifugal force. A flyweight cutout switch may also be included in the control circuit of the air start valve. This shuts off the starting air supply by de-energizing the air start valve. This device will automatically terminate the engine start cycle when the engine has reached a speed slightly in excess of self-sustaining speed. We'll explain the starting sequence of a generic twin-spool medium bypass gas turbine engine using two methods. Firstly, we'll go through the sequence using the engine controls to demonstrate the required actions, and the engine instruments and a generic air starting supply layout to illustrate the results of those actions. The second method will utilize a graphical representation of the relationship between RPM and EGT during a normal engine start sequence. This very simplified air start supply layout for a twin-engined aircraft shows each engine fitted with an air starter motor. When engine start is selected, each starter motor will be supplied with low-pressure, high-volume air from either the APU, the ground start unit, or another engine which is already running and capable of supplying air. On this particular start, we'll utilize the aircraft's APU to supply air. The aircraft's normal bleed air system ducting is utilized to pass the air to the starter motor. Non-return valves at the low-pressure and high-pressure engine bleed positions prevent air leaking back into the engine compressor during engine start. The engine instruments which require the most attention during the engine start sequence are the exhaust gas temperature gauge, EGT, and the high-pressure compressor rotational speed gauge, N2. These two parameters must be monitored closely to ascertain whether or not the start cycle is proceeding safely. Other instruments that should be monitored during the start are fuel flow, engine oil pressure, low-pressure compressor rotational speed, otherwise known as N1, system duct pressure, and the start valve open light. Normally the number 2 engine will be started first. For the first start of the day, right ignition is selected, and the number 2 engine start switch is selected to ground, which is the ground start position. The selection of ground opens the APU control valve and the number 2 engine air start valve. To indicate that air is getting to the starter motor, the start valve open light above the engine instruments illuminates. The starter motor turns the high-pressure compressor, which we can note by checking the N2 reading. This is an appropriate time to start timing the starter motor duty cycle. As the N2 increases, the oil pumps will produce sufficient pressure to extinguish the low oil pressure caption. At 24% N2, the number 2 engine start lever should be moved to the idle detent. This supplies fuel to the engine and initiates the AC ignition system. The operator should keep his hand on the start lever in case of an engine starting fault, in which case he should immediately close the start lever. On most twin or triple spool engines, it's advisable to ensure that the other spools are rotating in the correct direction, especially if starting engines with a tailwind. A short time after the start lever has been opened, the engine should light up. This is indicated by an increase in the EGT and an increased rate of acceleration of N2. At approximately 46% N2, the start switch will automatically move to the off position, and the start valve open light will extinguish. The starter duty cycle is now complete, and the N2 should continue to increase to the ground idle value of between 58 to 62%. When the engine RPM has stabilized at ground idle, the fuel control and, if appropriate, the ignition switch can be released and the after-start checks carried out. We'll now use this graph, together with the simplified air start supply layout, as the second method of demonstrating how the exhaust gas temperature and high-pressure compressor RPM relate to each other during a normal engine start cycle. As before, we'll again use the APU as the source of starting air. Upon engine start selection, air is fed from the ducting to the starter motor via the air start valve. The compressor accelerates under the influence of the starter motor and starts to force air through the combustion chambers. Initially, fuel and ignition are not supplied. Each type of engine will have a specific high-pressure compressor RPM when both the fuel supply and the ignition should be activated. Fuel and ignition are, in this case, selected by moving the start lever to the idle detent when N1 reaches 24%. Engine light-up is indicated by an increase in exhaust gas temperature and must occur within a specified time. 20 seconds is typical. The initial increase in EGT is quite sharp because of the fact that as combustion does not occur immediately after ignition is selected, there is an initial build-up of fuel in the combustion chamber. Once this fuel does ignite, it tends to overpower the cooling effect of air being fed from the compressor. Once the excess fuel is burnt off, however, and the fuel-air mixture becomes more balanced, the increase in EGT steadies. The gas, which is being produced in the combustion chambers, now adds impetus to the turbine blades, which eases the task of the starter motor, and the engine continues to accelerate. The accelerating engine drives the high-pressure fuel pumps faster and faster, until they eventually manage to drive sufficient fuel through the fuel control unit, which enables it to supply the idle level of fuel flow to the burners. However, the compressor is not yet running at idle RPM, so once again there is too much fuel being supplied to the combustion chambers, and not enough cooling air. Evidence of this is given by the second steep rise in the EGT. Eventually the engine accelerates to self-sustaining speed, which is approximately 36% N2. The starter motor is not, however, deselected at this point. It's kept operating to assist the engine to accelerate a little more. This gives the engine a better chance of reaching idle RPM without exceeding its limiting EGT. The igniters and the air supply to the starter motor will be cancelled automatically by an N2 speed switch at 40% N2. As engine acceleration continues towards this point, the EGT peaks. But as the airflow and the fuel flow become balanced at their idle RPM values, the EGT drops to the value appropriate to idle RPM. Ground idle RPM is approximately 60% N2 and 25% N1. A motoring overcycle, sometimes called a blowout cycle, may be required if there has been an unsuccessful attempt to start, as appears to be the case here. Any fuel which remains in the engine after an unsuccessful attempt to start has to be evaporated, blown out, or allowed to drain away before another attempt can be made to start the engine. Carrying out a blowout cycle should prevent torching, which is a phenomenon caused by excess fuel, which remains in the engine, catching fire in a subsequent attempt to start. To achieve a blowout cycle, the starter motor is activated without the selection of either fuel or the ignition system. When it's used for a blowout cycle, a typical air turbine starter motor has a duty cycle of 2 minutes on, followed by a 5-minute cooling down period. Always check the manual to determine the exact duty cycle of the starter motor that your engine has fitted. In the event of an engine flaming out while the aircraft is airborne, it may only be necessary to initiate the fuel flow and activate the ignition system without operating the starter motor to achieve a relight. The starter motor should not be required to rotate the engine in these circumstances because the engine should already be windmilling. On this aircraft, if both ignition systems are selected and the appropriate engine selector moved to the flight position, a relight should be achieved if the failed engine's start lever is moved to the idle detent. Evidence that an attempt to relight has been successful will be obtained from the EGT and RPM gauges. A rise in the value of either of these shows that a relight has occurred. It's really only possible to determine that a hot start is happening by comparing its indications to those of a normal start. The EGT may initially rise as normal, but then a rapid rise towards the engine's EGT limit caused by a hot start will become apparent a few seconds after light-up. In many cases, the only chance of stopping the temperature limit being exceeded lies in having the ability to switch off that engine's fuel supply as quickly as possible. Waiting for instructions or discussing the indications will almost certainly cost you or your company the price of a new engine. Hence the advice to keep your hand on the fuel supply control. If the EGT exceeds the limit by only 1 degree, the engine is to be considered unserviceable. The reasons for a hot start lie almost entirely in having either too much fuel or not enough air to cool the gases through the turbine. A surplus of fuel can be caused by a variety of reasons, such as the throttles either not being set to idle during the pre-flight check or being knocked away from the idle position after the pre-flight check. A shortage of sufficient cooling air can be caused by the engine not rotating fast enough, maybe because the duct pressure is too low to drive the starter motor at the required speed. Slow engine rotation could also be caused because ice accretion within the compressor annulus has caused a partial seizure of the compressor. A hot start can also be caused by the aircraft being positioned, perhaps for its second start of the day, with the wind going up the jet pipe, as opposed to the ideal situation when the wind would be going into the intake. The tailwind will make the job of the starter motor more difficult, and it will have more trouble pushing sufficient air through the engine quickly enough to keep the core temperature within limits. The residual heat that remains in the engine after shutdown will exacerbate the problem. The failure of the gas turbine engine to start, more commonly known as the wet start, is indicated by its EGT not rising and its RPM stabilizing at the maximum that the starter motor can achieve. If the engine fails to light up within the required time limit, which is usually about 20 seconds, then the ignition supply should be deselected and the fuel supply shut off. However, it may be some time before it's realized that there is a problem, and that the problem is a wet start. Starting malfunctions on gas turbine engines are rare and always come as a surprise, except in the flight simulator, where they tend to become the norm. Thus, there can be a long period during which fuel is being pumped into the engine before the problem becomes apparent. Throughout that period, the combustion chambers and exhaust system are becoming saturated with fuel. The fact that fuel is entering the engine can be confirmed by a glance at the fuel flow meter indication at the instant of moving the start valve to the idle detent. Two dangers exist if this fuel is ignited. Firstly, it will cause a very large jet of flame to issue from the exhaust system, the phenomenon called torching. And secondly, the rise of EGT may well be uncontrollable and could exceed its limitation. To prevent torching and excessive EGT, before attempting a second start, a motoring over or blowout cycle must be carried out. So, immediately the wet start is diagnosed, do not terminate the start cycle. Instead, promptly shut off the high-pressure fuel supply and deselect ignition, and then allow the starter to continue to turn the compressor with the time remaining in that start cycle before attempting a blowout cycle. These actions will allow the compressor to start blowing out any fuel from the engine even before you carry out the blowout cycle proper. The obvious cause of a gas turbine engine failing to start is a lack of ignition. The ignition units are generally quite reliable. However, they do sometimes fail. It can be difficult to determine from the cockpit of a large airliner whether or not you have sparks in the engine. On some aircraft there is a clue which is given by the very nature of the igniter units themselves. Really high energy outputs will sometimes make themselves heard on the intercom system as a background buzz. If you can hear that noise on the intercom during the start cycle, or when the relight facility is selected, then it's probable that the igniter units are operating. Alternatively, if your starter crew trust you, and if it's safe for them to do so, you could direct them to the rear of the engine, and having selected relight, ask them to listen for the asynchronous ticking noise which two high-energy igniters make when they're feeding sparks to two serviceable igniter plugs. Another cause of a gas turbine engine failing to start could be a lack of fuel, but this is fairly unlikely to occur on an engine that was working perfectly when it was shut down. A check of the fuel flow meter when the start lever is operated will give you ample evidence of whether fuel is being fed to the engine or not. The indications of a hung start are the EGT being higher than would be expected for the RPM at which the engine has stabilized, and the RPM being lower than the engine's self-sustaining speed. The high EGT is, however, usually not greater than the limit. Nevertheless, maintaining the engine in this state will do it no good at all, and could do it a great deal of harm. If a hung start is indicated, then the high-pressure fuel supply must be shut off and the problem investigated. The usual cause of a hung start is that there is not sufficient airflow through the engine to support efficient combustion. There could be a number of reasons for this insufficient airflow. For instance, if you're at a high-altitude airfield and you're attempting to start an engine which has a contaminated compressor, that compressor will choose this time to make its inefficiency felt. On the other hand, insufficient motive power being applied to the starter motor will prevent it from being able to rotate the compressor fast enough to push the required amount of air through the engine. This means that the gases generated in the combustion chambers will not have sufficient power to assist the starter motor in accelerating the engine beyond self-sustaining speed. Thus, once the starter motor cycle has finished, the engine RPM remains stable below the figure that will enable it to accelerate up to ground idle speed. Engine rundown time, or spool down time, is the time taken for the engine to stop after the high-pressure fuel supply is shut off. When the engines are shut down after flight, a mental note should be taken of the rundown time of each engine, and a comparison made between those times. Any engine with a rundown time appreciably less than the others should be noted. A short rundown time may be indicative of an impending malfunction.